Okay, so this topic is, what is a religion? One thing philosophers love to do is define their terms. If you're going to discuss something, you want to know exactly what it is that you're discussing, so that if you have a disagreement, it's a disagreement over the same thing. I mean, it's easy for one person to say, I think this about X, and the other person to say, well, I think the opposite about X. And they're not really disagreeing because they have different definitions of whatever X is. So to avoid that, you want to make sure that you define things. So a lot of philosophy through the ages has been trying to come up with definitions of things. So philosophers tend to start by asking, what is it that we're talking about? And as this is a philosophy of religion class, obviously, we need to at least try and define it. And also, defining religion is important for other reasons. It's important legally, for example. Religions are entitled to a certain status under the law. For example, they're tax exempt. If you qualify as a religion, you don't have to pay taxes, so long as you stay out of politics, supposedly. So you're not allowed to be party political from the pulpit, but the plus side is you don't pay taxes. So qualifying as a religion is an important thing. I believe Scientology qualifies as a religion in the US, but in Germany it does not. So there are certain practices that can count as religion from one point of view and not from another. And, you know, we talk about things like cults. Cults is generally a pejorative term. But is there a clear dividing line between a cult and a religion? When does something stop becoming a cult and start becoming a religion? Or does an official religion, was it never a cult to begin with? So, again, important to be able to at least attempt a definition. And one of the reasons I start this course with having you read these very short introduction books, like this one on Buddhism, is so that you have some raw material to work with, so that you know some basic information about at least 4 major what are counted as world religions. I didn't include Judaism in part because there's a lot of overlap with Christianity, and also, frankly, it doesn't have as many adherents as the 4 that I chose. And Buddhism is particularly interesting because it differs in some interesting respects from certainly Christianity and Islam. And it's in the book on Buddhism that they bring up Ninian Smart's dimensions of religion, which I've listed here and I'll get to in a second, in an attempt to discuss whether or not Buddhism counts as a religion. Before we get into that, though, I want to say a little bit about definitions in general. In the excerpt from the Clack and Clack textbook, there's a very short discussion where they distinguish between substantive definitions of religion and functionalist definitions of religion. And if that wasn't very clear, I'd like to try and clarify the difference between those types of definition, certainly of religion. And I think a helpful example to illustrate the difference is blood. Suppose somebody asks you, what is blood? And perhaps they asked a related question, do insects have blood? Now, if you give a substantive definition of blood, you might start with an obvious example of blood, our blood. And you might list its properties. You say, well, blood is, certainly if you were teaching a child what blood is, you might do this. You might give a list of the properties of the blood that we're most familiar with. So you might say blood is red, blood is a liquid, blood is what's in our veins and arteries, stuff like that. That would be a substantive definition in that it lists the properties that blood has. Now, the problem with any substantive definition is it tends to be quite restrictive. According to that definition, for example, it looks pretty clear that what insects have, except mosquitoes, and they've got our blood, but what what insects have of their own, their own liquid that goes through their innards, it doesn't meet that definition because it's not red, for one thing. If you smush any insect other than a mosquito that's just eaten, it won't make a red splat. What's in them isn't red. So according to that definition, they don't have blood. But that seems wrong to say. So in that respect, it seems better to give a functionalist definition of blood. So a functionalist definition of blood, as its name implies, is not defined in terms of the features that it actually has. It's in terms of the function or the purpose that it carries out. So, for example, a functionalist definition of blood might be a material for transporting oxygen around the body or something like that. And according to that definition, I don't know, I'm not a biologist or an entomologist, but I'm pretty sure insects would have that. They would have the functional equivalent. This comes up in philosophy of mind, for example. If you give a substantive definition of the human mind, then you're likely to go into detail about our brains and white matter, grey matter, you might go into detail like that. But then, of course, if we come across intelligent alien life, like in Star Trek or whatever, it's entirely possible that they won't have anything like that. They might not even be carbon-based. We're a carbon-based life form. Maybe they're a silicon-based life form. Maybe they're an intelligent gas or something. And then, do we want to say that they have a mind? Well, what functionalists say is, yes, we can say that they have a mind because they have something, even though it's made of completely different stuff from what our mind is made of, but they have something that serves the same role in their existence as our mind does in ours. So functionalism in philosophy of mind is quite a popular position. It allows, for example, for the possibility that we will create a sentient computer program because it will have a mind that is realized in a computer rather than realized in neurons and so on. So that gives some illustration of the difference. So substantive definitions of religion tend to focus on what might be a key feature of that religion. And the example that they give in the Clack and Clack piece is a definition that says by E.B. Tyler, who defined religion simply as the belief in spiritual beings. So, by that definition, to be a religion, you have to believe in spiritual beings. Okay, with that idea in mind, let me introduce you to a couple of tools that philosophers use when trying to come up with a good definition. If you want a classic example of where philosophers do this, where they argue over definitions or they try to proceed towards a good definition of something, the dialogues of Plato involving his teacher Socrates are good places to start because Socrates does a lot of that. So, for example, in the dialogue Euthyphro, Socrates tries to define piety, that is, the correct attitude towards the gods. And actually, the notion of piety plays very much a role of ethics, that ethics does in our society. And he proceeds, most Socratic dialogues work like this. He meets someone who claims to know a lot about something, and Socrates says, oh great, because I don't know anything and I'm always looking to learn. You explain to me about this thing. And in the case of the Euthyphro, he meets this guy Euthyphro who is about to prosecute his own father for something. And Socrates is amazed that you would do that, and he said, clearly you have a very strong sense of what is right, so you must be able to tell me what is it that makes something right and what makes something wrong. And Euthyphro is very full of himself and tries to do this. And then Socrates attacks the definition by showing that it is too broad or too narrow, usually. So let me give you an example. Suppose you wanted to define dog. Everybody knows what a dog is, so it should be easy. You should be able to give a definition of a dog. And suppose I said, my definition is, has 4 legs and barks. Now that's a substantive definition because it lists the properties that a dog has. In this case, to be a dog, it has to have 4 legs and it barks. Now, in order for a definition to be useful, certainly legally, the properties that you list have to be what is called essential properties. That is, properties the having of which makes you an example of the thing that is being defined. You don't just list properties that they often have or that they happen to have. That was the problem with defining blood as red. That seemed to pick a feature. It just happens to be a feature that our blood has, that it's red. But it's not an essential feature of blood. Blood can be blood without being red. And, well, let's look and see if having 4 legs and barking meets this level of being an essential properties. Well, it turns out it doesn't, because suppose your dog gets into an accident, steps on a rusty nail, and has to have 1 leg amputated. It is now 3-legged. Well, if the definition of a dog has 4 legs and it barks, if that was a correct definition, you would no longer have a dog. You would have some weird 3-legged creature that isn't a dog anymore, because according to your definition of dog, to be a dog you have to have 4 legs. Now, what that shows is that the definition has 4 legs and barks is too narrow, because it rules out things that actually are dogs. So it doesn't include all of the dogs. It doesn't include the 3-legged ones, for example. So if you include properties that are not essential, as if they were essential, like having 4 legs being essential for being a dog, then your definition ends up being too narrow. Now, it turns out that this definition has 4 legs and barks is also too broad. It is possible to be both too broad and too narrow if you've got a bad definition. There's a video that's been on the web for a long time. If you just go to YouTube and type in cat that barks, you will get a video of, I think it's from Russia, of this, it's sort of taken from behind. This cat can't see the camera, the person filming it, and it's sort of leaning out of a window, and it's barking. It makes a noise just like a dog. It's incredible. It's barking. And then the camera gets closer and closer, and when it reaches close enough, the cat suddenly realizes it's being filmed, and it turns around and looks at the camera and goes, meow! You know, like, oops, I've been caught. I better go back to being a cat again. It's pretty hilarious. But according to the definition of dog that we're working with, that would be a dog because it has 4 legs and it definitely barks. But clearly that is not a dog, it's a cat. So this definition of dog, a dog is something with 4 legs that barks, is too broad. It includes too much. It includes cats when it shouldn't. All right. So if we're going to define a religion, we want to make sure that our definition is neither too broad nor too narrow. What about this definition? Belief in spiritual beings. Well, a lot of people believe in ghosts. Does belief in ghosts count as a religion? According to this definition, it does, because ghosts are clearly spiritual beings insofar as we understand what spiritual beings are. They're not material beings. But it seems like this definition is missing something, because you could say, I think it would be perfectly fair if you ask someone, do you believe in ghosts? And they said, yeah. And you ask, are you religious? It's entirely possible that they would say, no, I'm not religious, but I believe in ghosts because maybe I've seen one, or I think I have, or whatever. So it seems like it's missing a key element of religion, maybe like the worship element. As they give a good example in the Clack and Clack, they said, we would not regard someone as religious who claimed to believe in God, but then added, of course, this makes no difference to my life. I wouldn't care if God didn't exist. This is kind of, I have a pet peeve. There's a song from the 90s. I've forgotten the name of the singer. She was kind of a one-hit wonder. And apparently she didn't really like this song. She didn't write this song, but it was her big hit. And it was, the song was, What If God Was One of Us? You still hear this on the radio sometimes. What if God was one of us? Has the worst lyrics. They've got to be intended to be funny. What if God is sitting at home, nobody calling on the phone, except the Pope sometimes in Rome, or something like that. It's like really bad lyrics. But what bugs me is the lyric that says, what if God was one of us, just a stranger on the bus trying to find his way home, or something. That wouldn't be God, or at least God in the way that we understand it. If it turns out that just somebody on the bus was God, it seems like believing in that person on the bus wouldn't make you religious. Sure, I believe in God, he's my buddy. And the lead singer of Jefferson Airplane, which changed its name to Jefferson Starship and whatever, Grace Slick, she named her child God with a small g, probably under the influence of several hallucinogenic drugs. But, if you say, I believe in God, he lives next door and he's still mad at his mom for giving him that name, that wouldn't make you religious either. So this is the problem that you often find with substantive definitions. Now, functional definitions of religion, which Clack and Clack seem to suggest are better. The problem I have with functional definitions is I don't think the practitioners of those religions would really would really accept that a good definition of what they practice is functional. Because functional definitions of religion tend to explain religions in terms of, obviously, the role they play in society, or the role they play in someone's life. So, for example, in the Clack and Clack, they suggested a functional definition is something that provides an answer to ultimate questions. But that doesn't say anything about how you answer these questions. I mean, I think it's perfectly possible that someone could be an atheist and deny vehemently that they're religious at all, and yet say that they have something that provides an answer to the ultimate questions. And in fact, a lot of philosophers are like that. A lot of philosophers say, I came to philosophy because I wasn't satisfied with religion, and I want a rational approach. I still want answers to what's the meaning of life. what is death bad? What happens when we die? These kind of things, the ultimate questions. But the answers that they find satisfactory are in a kind of atheistic philosophy don't involve, in their view, religion. So they would probably object to defining what answers their ultimate questions for them as a religion. And in that sense, that functionalist definition of religion seems too broad. It seems to include things that certainly the people who follow them would reject the label of religion for. I mean, what about someone who says, I want to know the ultimate answers, and I turn to particle physics? You know, I think that the most basic questions are, what are we composed of? Or where do we go when we die? And I find great comfort in the idea that what I'm made of is as old as the universe, and I will just return to the universe when I die. And I've learned that from studying particle physics. Does that make particle physics a religion for them? I don't think so. And defining religion functionally in that way seems a little bit patronizing. It's like, oh, you know, you only believe this because it gives the answer that you want. Like you believe in Christianity because you want it to be the case that when your body dies, you continue to exist and you get to go to heaven if you believe in the right things. And this is comforting to you because you're scared of death. That functionalist definition seems a little patronizing. All right. What about Ninian Smart's dimensions of religion? Now, as he says, this isn't really an attempt to define religion, but it sort of is. It's sort of meant to give a checklist of features that are present, seem to be, all of them are present in clear and obvious cases of religion. So, for example, Christianity or Islam seem to have all of these. And they do seem to be distinctive features. So ideally, when we give a definition of something, we first of all say, give a list of things that all examples of that thing have. But also, ideally, our definition will only be true of religion. So if I give a definition, if it's too narrow, then I've missed out important features that every example of the thing I'm defining has. If it's too broad, then it doesn't delineate clearly between the thing I'm trying to define and other things, like barking cats. And if we want to give a definition of religion, we want to draw a line between things that are religions and things that aren't. So that was the problem with the functionalist definition of religion, just whatever answers the ultimate questions for you. It seemed to cast its net too widely. It seemed to not draw a clear enough line between actual religions and non-religions. All right, so let's look at Ninian Smart's list. And one thing we can do with the list is we can sort of run down it and say, is this really an essential feature of all religions? Now, he would probably say, well, it's not intended to be. It's just supposed to be a list of features that are very prevalent in religions and that seem to be distinctive features. But at least let's understand what we're talking about. Okay, so what he calls the ritual dimension, and in the Buddhism chapter 1, he calls ritual / practical. This is where, so for example, in an Anglican or a Catholic church service, you go up and you have that little procedure where you get a little wafer, you eat the wafer and you take a sip of wine. This is a ritual that you go through as part of a church service that has meaning. As he says, he gives a definition of ritual: some form of outer behavior, such as maybe something as simple as closing one's eyes in prayer, coordinated to an inner intention to make contact with or participate with the invisible world. He's probably taking a risk in giving such a substantive definition of ritual. But yeah, ritual is something that is obvious to people that are watching you, that you're undergoing it. Like, for example, I always forget when it's Ash Wednesday, except I see lots of people with a smudge on their forehead, which is a ritual that some observant Catholics undergo. They put a little dash of ash on their forehead, in Ash Wednesday. That is something that you do. Or what's coming up now is the Hajj for Muslims, which is an annual pilgrimage to Mecca that you're supposed to undergo every Muslim is supposed to undergo that at least once in their lifetime. That's definitely a ritual. That's a practical thing that you have to undertake. So that does seem to be a common feature of religions. Now, what about, now, the trouble with ritual is ritual can have negative connotations, as Smart points out. If you call something ritualistic, often what you're meaning is, what you mean by saying that is that it's lost the meaning that it used to have. That, like, people are just going through the motions again, and it's no longer carries the significance that it used to. The philosopher Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who was a Christian, and in fact invented the notion of the leap of faith, if you've ever heard that expression, that comes from Kierkegaard. He was very critical of Christians in his society at his time because he said they'd stopped, they weren't really Christians anymore, they were just churchgoers. So for them, being a good Christian just meant doing the ritual, and according to Kierkegaard's criticism, that wasn't enough. They didn't lead an internal life. So what they were missing was the experiential or emotional element, that true religion has to have an internal element. So you might think of the practical as the outer practice, and the emotional or experiential as what goes on within you. So every religion, that has this dimension, will involve some kind of experience. So, you know, some denominations of Christianity, during a service, people can start speaking in tongues because they're having such a vivid experience, supposedly, that they are, something is speaking through them. Or you can have, or famously, Saul's experience on the road to Damascus in the New Testament. Saul was pursuing and persecuting Christians, and then had this conversion experience on the road to Damascus, changed his name to Paul, and is responsible for writing a goodly chunk of the New Testament. So much so that a road to Damascus moment is supposed to be like a religious experience of conversion. That seems to be important. Now, Buddhism, for example, does seem to involve meditation, is a very important element. It's also an element of Hinduism. So prayer, where the people praying experience some sense of communion with God, that would obviously meet the criterion, but so would meditation and things like that. So Hinduism and Buddhism would also qualify. All right, so number 3 is what Smart calls the mythic element. Now in the book he calls mythic/narrative to indicate that often when we talk about myths, they're understood as untrue, like the myth of King Arthur. There never actually was a King Arthur with Knights of the Round Table, or Robin Hood is probably a myth. So if you say that something is a myth, you're implying that it didn't happen. And while critics of religion would say, most of these things didn't happen, but certainly the believers think that they did. And in calling them myths, he's saying, I'm not saying that they're untrue, but I'm pointing to the idea that they're sort of very important stories. So they're stories that are supposed to, both on the one hand, be true and real descriptions of events, like supposedly Moses is supposed to have gone up the mountain and come down the mountain with 2 tablets with 10 commandments on them. That's supposed to actually have happened. But they also, they have significance. Like, it's not just that they happened, but them happening in a certain way is supposed to teach us a lesson about something. So in that sense, they're like stories. Stories, fables are exactly that. Fables are stories where the events are supposed to be symbolic of something that, that happened. And we see narratives are a very important part of a lot of religions. One of the most important features of, or one of the core elements of Hinduism, as you see from the very short introduction, is the story of Rama, the Ramanuja. Ramayana. Ramanuja is a Vedantin. Ramayana is the story, the epic story of Rama. And these events are not just supposed to be something that actually happened to Rama. The telling of them is very significant. And one of the things that they do in the book on Hinduism is say how feminists have taken over the story of Rama and twisted it in certain respects. So they've altered the story a little bit to make the significance different. So the telling of the story is very important and is a very key element in religions. In the 3 Abrahamic faiths, of course, one of the most important stories, one of the foundational stories, is the story of Abraham, hence Abrahamic faith, and Isaac, his son Isaac. Except it's Abraham and Isaac in Judaism and Christianity, but it's Abraham and Ishmael in Islam, because Ishmael is his other child by his Arabic slave woman. And it's in the Muslim telling of the story, that's the one, the son that he almost sacrifices until God tells him not to. So how the stories are told is very significant towards the particular religion. So that seems to be a key element common in a lot of religions. There seems to be a story involved. Of course, in Islam, a very important story is the story of Muhammad as well. So every religion tends to have a key figure. Now, it's not true that there's a Muhammad-like key figure in Hinduism, for example, because there's no clear founder of the religion. But then we just have important figures like Rama instead. Doctrinal. What is doctrinal? Well, doctrine or theology or philosophy tends to be something that emerges after the initial phase. So the initial phase is where you get these key figures, you get these key narratives. And then you get a body of literature, like, for example, in Islam, the hadiths, which is interpreting the original literature. So, for example, you have the Torah and the Talmud. So you have the interpretation of the original texts, and it's the interpretation which is the doctrinal element. That's when you know that your religion has developed a certain point, when you get interpretational differences. And in fact, it's doctrinal differences which can lead to splits. So for example, in Buddhism, you get the big split between Theravada Buddhism, which is sort of the original Buddhism, which interprets the statements of the Buddha literally. And then you get this offshoot, Mahayana Buddhism, which says that the statements of the Buddha should not be understood solely literally. and they have this version where they say the story of the burning house, where if your house catches fire, but your kids are inside playing, and you have to get them out of the house, you will tell them things that they want to hear first to draw them out, because you've got to save them first. And Mahayana says that actually what the Buddha told us was not literal truth. It was just something that we wanted to hear. So what Theravada teaches us about reaching personal nirvana, that's what we want to hear, and that's why it's attractive to us. But actually, according to Mahayana Buddhism, our job is instead to be a bodhisattva, to lead other people to nirvana. And that's harder to do, and that's not necessarily an immediate selling point to convert people to Buddhism. So that's why he didn't lead with that. Now that's an interpretation that says that the meaning of the original words is not what appears at face value. And you get a lot of this you get this all the time actually in Christianity. People pick particular phrases of scripture, and they give you they give you their interpretation. They say people have interpreted it this way, but actually the real interpretation, and they back this up with a convoluted theory. I mean, this happens in particular, for example, with Revelations, the book of Revelations, which of course is so weird that it opens itself to all kinds of competing interpretations. So the doctrine is the theory that makes sense of the original text or the original narrative. And you can tell when you've got a sort of a religion of a certain stage of maturity when you get the doctrine. So Roman Catholic doctrine, a very important figure is Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is a giant, he's Saint Thomas for that reason, a giant figure in Catholic theology, because he offers a very sophisticated philosophical theory sort of backing up and explaining a lot of the questions that arise in Christianity. Ethical and legal. It's certainly true. Ronald Reagan said that you cannot separate politics and religion. And he said you cannot separate politics and religion because politics is based on morality and morality is based on religion. Now, there's a lot wrong with that statement, but it just shows you that this is a commonly held view, that there is this close-knit relationship between right and wrong and ethics and religion. For an awful lot of religious people, their standards of right and wrong come from the religion that they practice. The Ten Commandments, for example. Even though in my classes, when I ask my students to name the Ten Commandments, most of them can't do it. And most of them, when they can do it, don't think that those are the 10 most important things. Honor thy father and thy mother. Anyone? I think any teenager has a hard time with that one. But yes, in their role in people's lives, religions do tend to give them guidelines for what they should and shouldn't do. This is certainly true in Buddhism. Buddhism requires an awful lot for people. The pillars of Islam, that requires a great deal of sacrifice. You're supposed to give up 10% of your earnings to help people. There is a huge ethical element to religion. Now, is it true, as Reagan thought, that without religion you don't have morality? No, certainly most philosophers would deny that. There's a huge literature on secular theories of morality. For example, utilitarianism, which says that the right action is the one that maximizes general happiness. That's totally secular. That has nothing to do with religion. So it doesn't seem like religion is essential for morality, that if we didn't have religion, we wouldn't have morality, as a lot of Christians in particular seem to claim. That doesn't seem to be true. but it's certainly true that for people get a lot of directives from their religion. And this can, although ethical and legal are different, you can have, the law is not the same as morality and vice versa. You know, certain things that are immoral are not against the law, for example, lying, and certain things that are against the law are not immoral. Driving on the left is against the law in America, but it's obviously not immoral. In fact, it's the right thing to do, as we British understand. So they're different things, they're different fields, but religions provide both kinds of rules. For example, in Islam, there is something called Sharia law, which is Islamic law, and this is presented as a very scary thing. For example, there's this rumor that was spread around in certain Christian circles that Dearborn is under Sharia law because, you know, as you know, there's a lot of Muslims that live in Dearborn. Obviously false. But even if it was under Sharia law, this isn't as scary as they like to make it out. Now, we have, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan that has a very repressive regime, and that's supposedly related to Sharia law. But there's a story in the book on Islam about when Islam overtook, I think it was the Maldives. They tried to institute these laws, for example, to get the women to cover up. Women in the Maldives went around without tops on, and you're not supposed to do that in Islam, but they refused. It didn't catch on, so the judge sort of just gave up and adapted to the local circumstances. And in general, Sharia law, even where it's in effect, is very different from place to place. It's very adaptable. So it's not often the case that even when religions have an impact on local laws and customs, that it entirely gets its own way. It tends to work in both directions. There tends to be influence from the local customs on religion. And that can be a good or a bad thing. Actually, one of the things that Islam gets blamed for is the cultural practice of female genital mutilation, which is common in some parts of Africa, and it has come to be associated with Islam, but actually is not Islamic, and in fact is not practiced in the largest Islamic countries like Pakistan or places like that, and is just a cultural practice from parts of Africa that has somehow got associated with Islam when Islam came to those countries. Social and institutional. This is where the religions are organizations. They have an effect on the running of the life of the community. This is related to ethical, but it's also a more basic level that doesn't necessarily have to do with right and wrong. Your week can be structured by your religion. So, for example, in Christian countries until very recently, all the shops used to be closed on a Sunday. Certain holidays are religious-based, or at least associated with a religion. So the everyday life can be structured in such a way. And then this can also be related with material. Material is not listed in the original Ninian Smart reading that I've given you as well, but it's added later in the chapter in the Buddhism book, and that's talking about literal objects that exist. And as he says in the Buddhism book, ignoring the material and focusing particularly on doctrinal. When the West, predominantly Christian, first encountered other religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, they tended to view them through the lens of their own religion. And they say, well, if we're going to understand this other religion, it's going to be like us. And what's very important for our religion is the doctrine, the philosophy. And that's what's most important. That's key to our religion, so it must be what's key to theirs. And what they suggest in the book is not necessarily. Different religions can have different focuses, and in fact, you should, the way a religion actually interacts with most people's lives is often in a material way. And this was ignored by the early Christian interpreters because that's not the way we operate. The Christians operate. As it says on page 15, although Buddhism can be studied through all of the 6 dimensions that Smart discusses, early Western scholars relied almost exclusively on texts for their information and tended to emphasize the doctrinal dimension above the rest. But nowadays they're looking much more closely about how religion has sort of entered material objects, and they include things, these objects include inscriptions, coins, images, symbols, ritual implements, rosaries, amulets, shrines, reliquaries, all the kind of things that archaeologists find lying around as evidence of the life of an earlier culture. And you can, in general, tell a Christian country because churches look distinctively different from mosques or from Buddhist temples. That's what is meant by material. Now, these are common features of unquestionable world religions. Now the question is, do you have to have all of these 7 features to count as a religion? As is discussed in Buddhism, this might rule out Buddhism. Maybe Buddhism is missing some of these things. Or what about young religions? Does something not count as a religion until it reaches a certain maturity? So, for example, was there no Christianity until about 100 or 200 years after Christ lived? Because you wouldn't have had a clear doctrinal theory. You certainly wouldn't have had much material evidence. When you only have Christ and a few followers, does it even count as a religion? That's an interesting question. Do we now have things that are pre-religions that look like they could develop into a religion? Should Scientology even count as a religion? Legally, it counts as one in the US, as I said, and it might be interesting to look at how it got that decision to count as a religion. What do they check for legally to count as a religion? In Germany, when you get your, I'm going somewhere with this, stay with me. In Germany, when you get your driver's license picture taken, you're supposed to have your head uncovered so that they can see your hair. However, they grant exceptions for religious head covering, as for example, Muslim women who think that they're required to have their hair covered in public. They're not required to take off their head covering at the DMV. They can have their picture taken with a head covering. That's allowed because it's deemed to be important enough to you because it's your religion. There is something called Pastafarianism, or the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. You can look this up. This came into existence as a satire. There was a big debate, I think it was in Kansas, about the teaching of intelligent design in science classes alongside the theory of evolution. That was a big culture war thing in the 90s, I believe it was, when religious conservatives wanted to say, the theory of evolution is just a theory, And here's another theory that is equally valid, which is this idea that, no, we didn't evolve, we were created by intelligent beings, God. And they were pushing, and I think they got the law changed so that intelligent design was being taught alongside evolution in public school. And to satirize this, a guy invented a religion. He said, well, if you're going to teach that, you've got to teach my religion too. And he invented a religion which was the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And he invented all of this story, and there's like a picture like the Sistine Chapel where God and Adam's fingers are touching. He did one with the Flying Spaghetti Monster, and Adam is being touched by his noodly appendage. It's like the meatballs are the eyes of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Anyway, people thought this was funny, but it particularly, people in Germany apparently really liked this. And people in Germany are claiming as their official religion Pastafarianism, which is the joke name for it, like Rastafarianism. And in Germany, somebody, at least one person, managed to persuade them that a colander, which is used for straining spaghetti when you cook it, was his religious headgear, and he was wearing a colander on his head in his driving license photo because it's his religion. Now, is that just a joke, or can we take that literally? Does Pastafarianism actually count as a religion? Do people have to believe it literally? If they did believe it literally, even though it was invented as a joke, does it get counted as a religion? What about QAnon? QAnon seems to have some of the elements of this. It certainly has a huge effect on people's lives. One of the things that makes religions distinctive and why religions are given these legal protections is because of their role in people's lives. They're very fundamental to people's conception of themselves. That's why they're regarded, why we have to make concessions to them. QAnon certainly seems to be fundamental to people's lives in exactly the same way. And, they seem to hold Donald Trump, for example, in a regard that is almost supernatural. Certainly, their view of him doesn't seem to match up to reality, to be honest. I mean, you see paintings of him, and he's got, like, ripped abs and things like that. Now, I'm sorry, whatever you think of Donald Trump, he doesn't have ripped abs under that giant suit. But people seem to regard him as an almost supernatural. And all of these stories that other people say are facts about him, they reject and say, oh, you don't really understand. And they do something that is very common in religion, like we were talking about with Mahayanism. They interpret facts or narratives non-literally. They say, you don't really understand the truth. The truth is much more complicated than you understand. And you've got to look for all these signs and symbols. And once you understand the signs and symbols, like numerology or whatever, then you really get to the truth. That sounds like what a lot of people do in religions. So, is QAnon becoming a religion? Is it going to be, is it going to reach the standard of religion? Is this how religions start? Do they start as kind of conspiracy theories? Well, that would be a cynical view of religion because it suggests that all religions are in some sense false. But what is the dividing line? Mormonism. Is Mormonism a separate religion? Is it an offshoot from Christianity? Is it not a religion at all? Where does Mormonism stand in this notion of religion? So that's the kind of question we're interested here. And I think if you write a paper on this topic, one thing that you should do is use the information that you've learned about the various religions, and you could go through and you could say, pick, say Buddhism in particular, or Hinduism or something, and ask whether or not it meets the standard, the cutoff. And then contrast it with something that you want to say is not a religion, and see if that doesn't meet these standards. So have we found a way to clearly delineate between religions and non-religions? Have we done enough? Do we really need to have something more? Is this not enough to describe a religion? Do we have to have a belief in an afterlife? Is that a crucial feature of a religion? It does seem like there are people who claim they're religious who don't believe in an afterlife. And actually one of the books of the Bible, Ecclesiastes, appears to have that as a clear message, that, that life ends in the grave, and does seem to imply that there won't be an afterlife. And certainly some Jews don't believe in an afterlife. Does that mean that they don't have a religion? So this is the interesting question, and I think it's an open debate, and what I want you to do if you write on this topic is have that debate. Just sort of analyze and say, what about this? What about this? You don't have to reach a clear-cut decision, but you have to engage in the discussion. And these are useful tools to use. If you can say, well, if we require this feature to be a religion, well, then that would include too much, or it would not include some things we want to include. Buddhism is often the standard here. If it requires a belief in a creator God, then Buddhism is not a religion. It doesn't have that. So that's the debate, and it's a fascinating one.